I thought of you when riding down on the train earlier, and riding on an Amtrak train must be a little odd for you. You spent so much time walking along the tracks. How's it feel to be on a train looking out?
It's really interesting for me, actually, because I'll spot campsites and places that I recognize from our trip. And it makes me a little paranoid because I think, what if the film became, something that like Amtrak conductors kind of had to watch or something? And what if they recognize me? Do they have the power to detain me? It sort of made me wonder, what would happen. But we were never approached by Amtrak after the film came out. Maybe they don't even know about it. Who knows? But there were no repercussions.
When Baltimore erupted not long ago, did you feel like you knew the streets a bit?
I did. I mean, our experience in Baltimore was so good. I mean, the people in the poorest part of Baltimore were so incredibly friendly and concerned for our welfare and welcoming. But it's obviously a community in an enormous amount of pain, and frankly, pretty racially divided. And then I found out, as you all have probably noticed as well, it was a terrible thing that guy died. But the cops in the van, of the 5 cops, the 3 who killed him were African American, which I thought was really interesting. And then it barely got talked about. And I mean, any death of a civilian in police custody is a tragedy and shouldn't happen. But I just thought there was an opportunity to talk a little bit more deeply about something. I don't even know what, and it sort of didn't happen. I was a little disappointed with that, actually.
I have a funny question for you, sort of out of left field. I thought of it yesterday before I left New York, and I saw a guy asking for money on the street with a sign saying he was a veteran. And I started seeing these signs in my hometown. I guess in the late 70s, everyone was a Vietnam veteran. But the veterans kept getting younger, so to speak, and there were still Vietnam veterans. And did you guys encounter people like that with signs saying, "I'm a vet, please give"?
Baltimore and Philly were really the only cities we walked through, and I don't specifically recall. I mean, I've seen that in New York City.
What do you think when you see those signs? Do you trust it or think it's a...
Boy, I hate to say this. I really do hate to say this, and there are an awful lot of homeless vets out there. But I got to say, I'm inclined not to trust it, actually. And I feel terrible saying that, but if you're asking for an honest answer, and that doesn't mean I won't give them money.
Yeah.
But I honestly, like from my heart, I think it's probably 60-40. That's not true.
After you've been in war, does everything seem kind of dull? And you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, I definitely
does
know
it seem
what you
kind
mean
of
by that.
ordinary?
Yeah, okay, yes. Regular civilian life in an affluent country, Western country, is way more dull, if you want to call it that, way more dull than combat. True, absolutely true. But then what I realized eventually was that the relative level of dullness and excitement in your life is not the only metric for measuring happiness and meaningfulness. There are other metrics, and that is an important one. We respond to excitement. I mean, we're animals. We like adrenaline, whatever. I mean, of course, we have all those responses. But there's other forms of meaning and contentedness that actually can't happen in a situation that's too exciting or certainly that's dangerous. And so, for me, maturing as an adult meant actually understanding that, and not just being like, oh, this is silly, this is just boring civilian life, I want to go back to the front lines. And that's actually, in some ways, it started to feel like a kind of immature way of seeing life. Took a while though, and it took the death of my friend actually to sort of push me over that edge where I started to see it that way.
You've had your fill of war and war-related things, have you?
Yeah.
I mean, if you never looked at combat for the rest of your life, it'd be fine with you.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's my intention. When Tim was killed, I mean, I talk about it in this film, when Tim died, I made an almost immediate decision not to cover war anymore. I was married at the time when Tim was killed, and it was initially out of concern for my wife. She really loved Tim. His death just devastated her, and I thought, my God, if Tim did that to her, what would my death do? And then I realized that even if nothing happened to me, and probably nothing would happen to me statistically, still, we found out about Tim by phone. The phone rang in our apartment, and that's how we got the news. And I thought, wow, every time I'm gone, even if I come home fine every time I'm gone, whenever the phone rings, she's going to remember what just happened with Tim, and she's going to jump every time. And if you love someone, you don't want them to live like that. Like, what my career, my need for excitement is not more important than her state of mind. I mean, I suddenly felt very strongly that I was starting to put myself first, and that's not good. So I stopped. And then after I stopped, I realized that I was quite relieved to not be covering war, and that it wasn't that I was scared of it. It's that it for the first time in my life, instead of being something that was tragic and all this other stuff and exciting, it stopped being exciting and started being profoundly depressing, just profoundly sad. And at that point, no, danger is one thing. No one wants to be around something that is sad. Like, sadness is not appealing. And
there's no rush in sadness.
No, there isn't. And now, seriously, like, there's combat footage on TV. It used to give me this little jolt of like, oh, I wish I was there. Who was that shot that footage? Now I literally don't look at it. Like, I just don't want to see it. It's really funny.
Do a little updating for us, would you? Like, how's Dave doing? Where is he in Afghanistan?
Well, no, he's not in Afghanistan anymore. We had a failure rate of about 50%. No, exactly 50%. Of the four of us who had said we weren't going to go back to combat, two of us did. Guillermo went to Ukraine, and he's been in and out of Ukraine the past a year and a half. And Dave went back to Afghanistan, I think it was twice, as a private contractor, actually, but still very much front lines, carrying a weapon and all that. And he's since gotten completely out of that business, and I'm not sure exactly what he's doing now. He bought a 90 acres of woods in central Wisconsin, and I think he's happy as a clam, and he works a bit. I mean, I'm not quite sure what he's doing.
Is Guillermo working as a photojournalist in Ukraine?
Yeah, exactly. He's a photojournalist.
How's Brendan doing?
Brendan's doing great, actually. Since the last patrol ended, he stopped drinking. He struggled with drinking the whole time during the patrol. Not while we were walking. He never had alcohol on him while we were walking, but between trips, he was in and out of pretty dangerous form of alcoholism. And he finally took his last drink a year and a half ago. He's been completely clean and sober since then. He just got into, keep in mind, he didn't finish high school. He went off to reform school at 17. He just got into college at UNH, University of New Hampshire. He's earning money. He has an 80% disability rating for PTSD. He's going to ask the government to cut that off. He doesn't want it. He feels like the government has helped him out. The country helped him out when he needed it, when he was down, and he's not down anymore. And he feels, I'm sort of speaking for him, but he said literally these words to me. He feels it's a little bit dishonorable to take money that you don't need from the country. And so he's cutting off his disability. He just doesn't know how to do it because there aren't any forms for cutting off. You can apply for disability all day long, but there's no forms for cutting it off. So it's which is sort of funny. And I'm actually urging him to write about that, like an op-ed or something. I think it'd be very, very interesting for people. So he's doing really, really well.
And tell us, how's Daisy?
Daisy's great. She's probably doing the best of all of us. She's
walking a little less.
Yeah, Well, I kept doing sections of railroad line after the project ended. Brendan and I kept going out there, either just the two of us or with a few people. And so we're back out there once in a while. Brendan and I did We called it 40 and 40. We walked 40 miles in 40 hours, and we want to work up to 100 and 100. And we're still out in Pennsylvania, heading west towards Ohio. And but Daisy's great. She's 8 years old. She doesn't look a day over 7. And I know she's still very physically capable, wonderful dog. And yeah, she's fantastic.
I find myself kind of two minds. First, we're told not to condescend to returning vets, not to caricature them or stereotype them or regard them as somehow damaged beings or dangerous beings or even troubled ones. At the same time, there is a lot of trouble and troubled people. So I'm not exactly sure what to think. I suppose it's case by case. We're all individuals.
It's so complicated, and I mean, civilians can be kind of out to lunch. I mean, just categorically, Americans, and veterans can be really contradictory and problematic as well. I mean, this military-civilian divide, it's there partly because of attitudes that civilians have, and partly because of attitudes that soldiers, veterans have. It's both sides are putting into this and creating this divide. And I think there are veterans who come back sincerely traumatized and burdened by their service for this country. I mean, really. Brendan was one of them. So he and I are best friends. I said, "Oh, watch this up close," But there's a I feel like sometimes with veterans that there's a bit of like a kind of off-putting, like you'd never understand, to a sort of dismissiveness to civilians, like you'd never understand. And I feel like, okay, so if you feel like we'd never understand, then you can't blame us for not understanding. Like that can't be a reason to not talk to us. And if you don't talk to us about what your experience, you can't blame us for not understanding. I mean, it's a chicken and egg thing, and I don't know where to end it. It's very complicated. It's very complicated.
You hear a lot, and I suppose it's true, that most Americans don't have a real sense that there is a war on or have been wars on. Most people are removed from it. And I know some military people have said that you'll hear people say, well, I'm war weary. We Americans, we're war weary. And military people want to say, what do you mean you? We're the only ones with the right to be war weary. Does it, from your experience, does it bother military people that we civilians, I should say, people like me, aren't as involved or tuned in as maybe we should be?
I mean, I think it might, except for the life of me, I can't figure out what tuning in would look like. I don't know, being involved in the war as a civilian. So, you're a middle-aged school teacher in Kenosha, Wisconsin. What does it mean to be involved in the war? Like, I don't even know.
No idea.
Yeah, I mean,
sending a care packet, contributing to USO, I don't know what it means.
But that's not even, I mean, that's a contribution to something good, but that's not really emotional involvement, right? It's a check, it's a whatever. In World War II, there was 16 million people in the service, something like that, right? Now, after 15 years of war, something like 2 million have passed through. I mean, I'm going by memory from numbers. Something like that, 2 million people have passed through deployments overseas. So there's an order of magnitude difference in the size of the military. And of course, if you have 16 million people in uniform, you've got 160 million who are intimately connected to those people. Pretty soon you're talking about the entire country is emotionally connected to the war. We have a technological capacity and a strategic capacity that doesn't, and we have an enemy that doesn't require a 16 million man army. That's great, but the downside is the country can feel like they're not connected to the war, and I understand not feeling connected to the war. I mean, here's another example. I just read the first thing when I first started working as a journalist. One of the things that really interested me was dangerous jobs. I used to be a high climber for tree companies. I took trees down from the top down on a rope with a chainsaw, and it was difficult, tricky, sometimes well-paid, but definitely dangerous work and thrilling work, exciting, very exciting work. And I hurt myself. I hit my leg with a chainsaw, and I was laid up for a bit. And I started thinking about dangerous jobs. Maybe I'll write about dangerous jobs. Maybe that will get me out of the treetops. I was like 30 years old, and I needed to get a plan. And but I was always interested in dangerous work. And of course, it's a class issue, right? I mean, blue-collar people do jobs that get them killed for the most part. And so the number of people killed in the workplace last year, and it's logging, fighting fires, farming, drilling for oil, commercial fishing. I mean, you all can, I'm sure, sort of like imagine very easily what the most dangerous jobs are.
I suppose police work in some areas.
In some areas, but not nationally. It's not.
Not in Mayberry.
Not in Mayberry. Yeah. The death toll, the mortality on the workplace, and again, this is most overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly working class people. The death toll just last year equals the entire death toll of our involvement in Afghanistan for American soldiers, just last year, right? And you can say that Americans are not that connected to that tragedy either. We're not thinking, we drive a car, we're using oil. I'm not thinking about the guys who died on the rigs, I'm just not. I'm sorry, So that disconnect in a modern society between most of the population and its means of protection and survival, that disconnect, it doesn't just happen with the military, it happens with everything, with all of the dangerous industries that keep this whole circus going. That disconnect happens with all of it. And I think there is a class issue there, actually. And I wish, just as a nation, I wish we were just more plugged into the whole thing, because frankly, it all deserves to be honored and acknowledged.
Sebastian, you've been a war reporter. I wonder whether you regard it as a war service or a contribution to the war effort. I do. I think of that Shakespeare phrase, to hold your manhood cheap. And I think a lot of men hold their manhoods cheap because they've not been to war. That must be true, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can claim to know the minds of other men, but I can talk about my own for sure.
Yeah.
I very much felt when I was, I grew up in a pretty affluent suburb in the Northeast, outside of Boston.
Belmont.
And very, very liberal family. During Vietnam, everyone I knew was very much anti-war, and I grew up very much immersed in that world, and eventually I grew up enough to see what was beautiful about that outlook and what was really flawed about it. I mean, you grow up and you start to get some perspective on your cultural background, and but I remember turning 17, turning 18, turning 20, turning 25, turning 30, and having this sense, I was just wondering, am I a man yet? And how do I know? How will I know if I'm a man? And I had the sense, and I think this is a very ancient sort of Joseph Campbellian sort of way of thinking about manhood and rites of passage, but I had the feeling that you're really not a man. And, I'm saying man, I can't claim to speak for the experience of being a woman, and it's a whole different set of issues and challenges and rites of passage, and I'm really just talking about the experience as a man that I've had as a man. I had the feeling that you're really not a man until you've been challenged with something that you're not sure you're going to survive. You have to be put in that place where you're not sure this is going to work out well, and you have to dig really deep to get through it. And that's exactly what initiation rites were in tribal societies around the world. It's exactly what they tried to produce in young men. They tortured them, they scared them, they put them through terrible ordeals. They wanted to make them not sure this was actually going to work and that they were going to survive this. And then afterwards, they were now men. And so the only way I could think of, growing up in the sort of affluent suburb that I did, the only thing I could think of that might make me feel that way was going to war. And I couldn't join the service because the United States wasn't at war. I grew up during Vietnam. The next war I thought we'd be in would be, I mean, when I grew up, the next war, the next real war would be nuclear war, and it'd be the last war.
Yes.
You remember
Yes.
that? Yeah.
Yes.
So, but there was a civil war in Bosnia. My father grew up in Europe, and war very much affected his family. And I thought, I want to understand war, and I want to be changed by it. And I went off in 1993 at age 31. I filled up a backpack with a sleeping bag and some clothes, and I think I had about $5,000 and some notebooks and pens and a manual typewriter, because I'd heard they didn't have any electricity in Sarajevo when I was headed to Sarajevo. A manual typewriter. I filed my first articles on a manual typewriter, and I'd fax it from the BBC office, I can't remember, and I went off to war.
Jay, do we have time maybe to take a question or two from the audience?
Of course. Are we going to 8:30 as planned, or are we? Yeah?
Is it 8:30? Okay.
Well, don't be shy. Raise your hand.
And we've got some microphones, so if you just wait for the microphone so everybody can hear the question, would be great. Notice that we have a hand question back there.
Yes, sir. My name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator.
Hi.
And my question is that these young people are willing to give, supreme sacrifice. They have unity, they have discipline, they have faith. They are so spiritual there. So looking at their lives, and when they talk about coming back and talking about alcohol, depression, and domestic problem, don't you think that war could be described as an investment? Thanks.
An investment, that's interesting. I mean, I'm not sure I entirely understand, but I can say that a lot of the guys that I was with in Afghanistan, American soldiers, that they really miss the war. They miss being over there. And what they miss is feeling necessary and meaningful in a small group of people that they love, that they die for. That sense of meaning and purpose is pretty intoxicating. And forget about the adrenaline. I mean, of course, we all understand, adrenaline rush. Get rid of that idea. That's in there somewhere, but it's not important. It's the sense of purpose and meaning in a small group. And that, think about life in a platoon, 30 people in a remote area, 30 to 50 people in a remote area, doing everything, sleeping together, eating together, defending themselves together. That basically reproduces our evolutionary past as a species. I mean, we evolved as hunter-gatherers in basically groups of 30 to, as it turns out, groups of 30 to 50 individuals in a very harsh, dangerous environment, doing everything together. So when a young man joins a combat platoon and is in Afghanistan, those guys are basically experiencing our evolutionary past that we're absolutely wired for, right? And it's like the first time you hold a baby. That clearly humans are wired to do this because it feels good, it feels right and natural and profound. And that's exactly what happens in a platoon in combat. And then they come back, and this society, for all of the blessings that we have of our affluence in modern Western society, true blessings, real blessings, for all of those blessings, there's an enormous downside to affluence and modernity, which is the increasing isolation in which people live. And you can see it, you can graph it. As income goes up in a society, mental health problems go up, not down, they go up. Suicide, depression, anxiety, insomnia, child abuse, they all go up. And so...
It's because people can afford those problems somehow? Are they luxuries of affluence?
I think a lot of mental health issues stem from loneliness. And the community experience is a great buffer for mental health, for depression, for example. Anxiety, incredible buffer. So when you have children who grow up sleeping in their own bedroom, unheard of in most of the world, right? Who's wealthy enough to have, give each child a bedroom, right? That's modern Western society. Very few parts of the world can even conceive of that, and what they also can't conceive of is why you would want to do that. Like, why would you want everyone isolated in their own bedroom?
I could give testimony.
Yeah, right. And so I think what happens is as income goes up, we can afford to live more and more individualized lives. We can decide to move to San Francisco away from our parents so our kids won't be around their grandparents. We won't be on the street who lives on the street they grew up on? Like, raise your hands. Does anyone live on the street they grew up on? Not one person, right? That's extraordinary. I mean, you ask that question anywhere else in the world, like most of the room raises their hand. It's amazing. So those community connections that happen generation through generation, apparently they're a great buffer for trauma, for distress. We don't have that. We have a lot of other things which are absolutely wonderful. I'm not knocking modern society at all. I get it. I mean, I had a kidney stone removed last summer. Like, I'm glad it didn't happen, 500 years ago, right? But there really is a downside, and when soldiers come back, they're often emotionally fragile. They've been traumatized. They're kind of the canary in the coal mine, and they're affected immediately by something that affects, I think, all of us in a kind of low-grade way throughout our lives.
Question over here. Oh, over there? Yeah. This one up here.
I'll try to be brief. Adriana Popa.
Hi.
I found it very interesting when you talked about your father's view of the world. My father's also a physicist, also European. Actually, both my parents are. And I was just wondering what you saw in practice as a coping mechanism, more the rationalization that your father would represent, or more, the spiritual sort of going back towards maybe a religious view. And I'm also asking because my parents, when they, for instance, went through the revolution that brought down communism in my country, even though they had the same background, took very different approaches. And one was the rational one, and the other one was the other.
Well, can I ask what country you're from?
Romania.
Romania, okay. My mother, neither of my parents were religious. My father was a supreme rationalist and completely out to lunch. I mean, seriously, he really had Asperger's, I think. I mean, I now realize, he had no ability to read emotional signals from anyone else. He was really in his own world. And actually, I think, in a funny way, I think he was fine there. My mother was sort of spiritual, and I think she sought some comfort in a sense of mysticism and spirituality. Frankly, I think my father was happier. Seriously, my mother would sort of go from philosophy to philosophy and never quite settle down on anything, and so they definitely, I don't know if it's a male-female split or what, but they definitely went their different ways. And my mother was a painter, is a painter. She's still alive. My father just died, but so I got some idea of artistic, the sort of nobility of the artistic endeavor from my mother. But I got from my father this sort of rational way of evaluating things, and that the combination actually was great for me. I don't think I would want to be either extreme. And my father, it was so great. He was, we would talk about politics and stuff sometimes, and he was a Democrat, and he said, but at the end of the day, things are either empirically right or they're not. And that has nothing to do with politics. That completely transcends everything, right? It's right or it's not right. And so in some ways scientists are they're so pure, or they should be, so pure in the way they understand the world. And in a weird way, they kind of leave everyone else in the dust.
Did you inherit some of this scientific talent?
No, I really love the rationalist approach to the world and life. But I'm at least judging by my performance in high school, a terrible scientist.
Your SAT score is supposed to be off the charts, I'm guessing, with your physicist parents.
I had to.
Thank you. It's good to see you. Wonderful film.
Thank you.
I saw you at a book signing in Olson's in Arlington about 10 years ago, so it's interesting to see
You're younger then.
the
I was
person.
younger. Do I
We
seem
all-
less nervous
I
than
mean,
10 years ago?
You seem more approachable. Not that you weren't then.
Yeah.
You were very friendly then, but you seem you seem very approachable.
I'm definitely more relaxed.
Yeah, I mean, and boy, to think of the Northern Alliance and how all of that is almost ancient history, and it was only 10 years ago, or 15 years ago. But I knew I was in the right place because I couldn't find an umbrella in the car, so I grabbed this military issue poncho.
Awesome. Yeah, right. You saw, yeah.
And just randomly, my dad came home from Vietnam, and he really honestly says to this day, he has no. He does not hold to the belief that war damaged him or scarred him at all.
Yeah.
Now, the years that he was if a truck banged on the road outside, he would roll off the bed and crawl under it without even waking up. May or may not testify otherwise. As an Army brat, I find myself confused by the experience of my father having been to war and my not having been to war. I made that decision not to go to West Point, all that guilt that comes with that. And that's kind of the main issue that I deal with. So I just wanted to ask what you think of the experience of the children of war, both today and in past wars.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I can imagine that would be confusing. I mean, again, I'm going to have to speak for, in a limited way for sons. I don't know for daughters what that would be like. But for sons, I think there is a sort of residual issue of war and manhood. You know, I think they're connected in some ways in our society, rightly or wrongly. You know, I don't know. I don't want to judge, but I think they are connected, and I can imagine. My father had asthma. He couldn't serve, and he felt. So what he did was he was a trained physicist, and so he worked in Paterson, New Jersey, designing helping design jet engines that became part of the war effort. So that was what he did. But you know, he talked about how he felt that he was shirking his duty, and that other men were going. You know, he grew up in Europe, so young American men were going off to fight and die, liberating his homeland, and he was staying home, and that was a real burden for him, right? And now, had my father served in the military, and I didn't, I can also, you know, I can see it's complicated. I think ultimately, the military doesn't need all of us, but the nation needs all of us for something. And I think ultimately, the work of a school teacher, the work of a welder, the work of a businessman, a small business owner, you know, whatever. You know, it's like, what part of the car is more important, the carburetor or the wheels? You know, it's like you can't even have that conversation. It's all important. And I think we have to get to a place in this country where all those things are valued. You know, like it's a very strict. I studied anthropology in college, and I did my field work on the Navajo reservation. And I can tell you, for a tribal society, because they lived so close to the margin, and because everything and everyone was necessary, it was absolutely ludicrous to like value a warrior more or less than a basket maker. I mean, what are you going to do with those baskets? How are you going to carry water? You know? So I think this nation, I mean, we're so divided right now, and I think one of the things we have to do is try to understand how necessary all of us are. And I mean, it's sort of a roundabout way of talking about the issue you're talking about. But, you know, ultimately, I feel like I mean, I didn't serve in the military. I had no reason to. There was no war to fight that I felt needed to be fought. And so I tried to make myself useful to this country in a different way. And as you said, you know, I did my own kind of service in a way that I felt where I was most valuable. And that was, I started going to Afghanistan in the mid-90s. So when 9/11 happened, I was in a great position to explain to people like what was going on in that country that had brought such pain and trauma to our shores, you know. And it's a kind of service, you know. But I know school teachers too, and that's a kind of service. You know, it's all service.
Hi, my name's Dave Price. I'm a retired journalist and educator.
Hi.
First of all, kudos. I mean, there's not
Thank you.
words to describe how much. I was just sitting here, so it's not so much a question, but two observations. One is that I really think that film should be shown in schools all over. And the reason I say that is it captures many sides. A lot of our kids today are getting getting what they know from, Call of Duty 727 or whatever volume of the new game is out. But this looks at it that way, and it shows both that there's courage involved, but there's also questions involved. The second observation that I thought was really interesting as I was watching the film, your group walking slowly, having these discussions, and the Acela trains going so fast by that kind of captures maybe part of the problem today, that we don't slow down. I mean, you're not going to go back. We're not going to go back
No.
to that Amish wagon.
No, we're not.
We're not. But by the same token, that more of that type of thing could be done, or would hopefully be done, because we all seem to be rushing around so much to get this thing done, and we don't get, maybe we don't want to go for 40 days and 40 nights hiking, but just groups sitting
Right.
down talking. But again, I just want to say, what a phenomenal job.
Thank
Phenomenal.
you. Thank you. And I love that metaphor that you spotted there. And I never saw it. It was right under my nose the whole time. But yeah, I mean, there's modern society rushing by, and we're plodding along. And actually, we're having what turned out to be a very urgent, meaningful, emotional conversation. And we wouldn't have been in the Acela. I think it's great for people to get together in groups and talk. Of course, why not? I actually think that the real change and connection and trust happens when you're spending entire diurnal cycles together, when you're actually relying on each other for fundamental needs like water and food and shelter. Like you start to do that, and that's why combat's so compelling, is because you're relying on everyone in the group for everything. Like it's an extraordinary experience, and I think you don't have to walk along railroad lines to do it, but what I wanted to do with this film was sort of show to vets, look, be creative, think of something. This is one thing you can do that actually reproduces the intimacy of combat without the bang bang over your head, but it does produce that intimacy and interreliance, and that's the place where people trust and heal. It's like in that thing. And there's a lot of ways to do it. I'm partial to walking along railroad lines, but it's just me.
Hey, thank you for your work. I enjoyed
Thank you.
the film very much.
Thank you.
You mentioned you got from your mother this idea of the nobility of the artistic endeavor. What would you say you hope people take away from the film as far as that idea is concerned? In other words, you put a lot of effort, your heart and soul into it. So what do you hope we take away from the movie?
Well, just to sort of start, I hope, first of all, people take away something more nuanced about being a soldier than, you did your duty. That's true. They did do their duty, what they saw to be their duty. But there's a whole lot more going on in the experience of combat than that. I hope people see that in the conversations that we had. I also hope they see what an incredible country we live in, and incredible in every way. It's incredibly diverse. There's incredible unity. The division and the unity both in this country is extraordinary. And I was very moving to me. You go to the poorest neighborhoods and say, what's the greatest thing about this country? And people say freedom. Like, that was amazing. I didn't expect that. I don't know what I expected, but I wasn't quite that. And but it's also a country that's very divided. Racially, economically, it's very divided, and in dangerous ways. And I think the fault of that, the blame for that division, lies actually everywhere. It's not just with the poor. It's not just with the rich. All those narratives I think are false. I think it's sort of everyone has let it happen. But ultimately, I walked through this place, and by the end, I really loved this country in ways that I hadn't before, because I understood it a lot better, and I understood how much pain this country's in, or a lot of people in this country are in, and I also understood how proud people are to be Americans, and it's totally independent of income. It's just really moving, and so I hope all of that sort of comes through, and and finally. The four of us just had such a good time. I hope that was apparent. We really laughed a lot. We got really close. We had a blast. We really, really had a good time. And that sort of small group intimacy, I think, is for people who are in a delicate place, in a critical place in their lives, that kind of small group intimacy can literally be life-saving. And I hope we sort of showed an example of it. This is the good stuff. You don't want to live your whole life like this. But if you can get back to something that feels like this once in a while, you will really be better off.
Hi, Sebastian.
Hi.
Elaine Rogers.
Yeah.
You've worked with so many military. I'm just curious, how did you select, or how was that done, where you chose those two veterans to be with you during this voyage? It was an incredibly affecting film. It's like,
Thank you.
oh my God.
Thank you. Well, Brendan O'Byrne, I mean, he was the guy I was closest to out in the Korengal Valley. I was in Kunar Province, a place called the Korengal Valley. I made a film called Restrepo, in case you don't know that. Brendan was one of the guys in the platoon, and the guy I got absolutely closest to. He's the subject of my book, War. We're extremely close. He was a natural choice. He's very thoughtful. I mean, you can tell, right? He was a very sort of thoughtful young man. Dave Rolls, I didn't know that well, but I really liked him. I liked the idea of going with a soldier I didn't know that well, too, who had also been out at Restrepo. He was about to get out of the military, and I liked the idea of having someone who had just gotten out and sort of watching them just as their sort of feet hit the ground back in the U.S. And Guillermo, of course, I know because of this tragedy with Tim. And, you know, Guillermo was holding his hand when he, my best friend. You know, Guillermo was holding his hand when he died, and it should have been me there, you know, and it wasn't. And so that created a bond between Guillermo and I that I think would be there even if we didn't like each other. But we do like each other enormously. He's a beautiful, amazing person. So that was how I, slightly random, but not entirely.
So why don't we have two hands over here, and then we'll kind of see where we are.
Thank you. I wanted to touch back on a comment that you had made a little bit earlier when you were talking about some frustrations perhaps that civilians have with not really being able to communicate that well with folks who are in the military, whether they're active duty or whether they're retired or medically separated. And when I looked at your film and saw this kind of great healing take place among the four of you in this very culturally specific environment, the four of you being that familiar with the military, whether you served as a photographer, a journalist, or as a serviceman.
Right.
How then do you see or could you recommend, given that that healing took place so specifically among the four of you, does it need to be that way, or can we communicate with the service members and vets in a constructive way to bring about healing? Because I imagine you being on that trip with two non-military people, how effective would it have been to change the cultural dynamic?
Right. Thank you. Really interesting, good question. I hadn't quite framed it in my mind that way before you said that. One of the anthropologists I spoke with, for my article, I can't remember if I mentioned it or not. I have an article in Vanity that was in the last issue of Vanity Fair about PTSD. And I interviewed a lot of anthropologists to see how people adapt to trauma, recover from trauma in other societies. And is being, in a modern society, psychologically a burden in trauma recovery? It is, absolutely. So one of the anthropologists, the Israeli military has a PTSD rate of 1%. They're a much more cohesive society. They're a modern society, but they're way more cohesive, partly because there's national service, I think. And the war is right on their doorstep. You know, the logic of having to fight is very, very obvious. On some level, the logic is less obvious when soldiers get onto planes and disappear for a year at a time, 8,000 miles away. It's just on a human level, it's not quite as obvious what we're fighting for. For the Israelis, it's very obvious, right? And so anyway, I talked to one guy, one anthropologist, and he said, trauma is usually a group experience. Some people are traumatized by themselves, and that's a very, very difficult thing. But generally, in human history, trauma has been a group experience. And recovery from trauma needs to be a group experience. So what's helpful to vets is some kind of recovery and therapeutic process with other combat vets, not with vets who weren't in combat. You really have to, like, in your mind, understand there's a very, very sharp division. The 10% who served in combat and the other 90% who didn't, who have other totally legitimate psychological issues, absolutely, but it's not trauma. And the people who really were traumatized, because you can't be in combat and not be traumatized. It's psychologically impossible unless you're a sociopath. So that 10%, they are going to heal much more effectively with each other in some form, whatever that form is, than they are going to heal with other vets who were not shooting their guns, who are not getting shot at. And certainly they're going to heal better together than they will with civilians. I don't think there's much civilians can do for soldiers who are in combat in terms of understanding and healing. I don't, I mean, I'm just trying to imagine like something that I can empathize with but will never really understand. Childbirth is very dangerous, it's very painful. I imagine can be quite traumatic. The death rate, before Western medicine, in other words, till about like 100 years ago, the death rate in childbirth was 1% per birth. So a woman who got pregnant 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 times, that starts to be the mortality rate of soldiers in combat. That's the time of our great grandparents. Just yesterday, basically. Can I really understand the terror and the pain and the ecstasy of childbirth? No, I can't. I'm never going to understand it. Am I going to be able to help a woman recover from a difficult childbirth and help her heal? No, probably not. Will she be able to do that better with other women who have gone through something? My sister gave birth by herself in a bathtub in an apartment alone. Just bad timing. No, I mean the doctor was en route and got stuck in traffic, and that was hard on her. I'm not going to help her with that. But I bet other women who have gone through the fear of that could help her, can help her. So that's soldiers. I don't know how to set that up, but I think one of the problems is that there's an unrealistic expectation. It comes from a good place. Like, we all want to help, of course, right? But I actually don't think the civilian world can, in that sense, help heal combat veterans. I think we can make it more possible to heal. I think we can fund the VA. We can do this. We can do that. There's a lot of things we can do that allow it to happen, but we're not going to ourselves do it.
Thank you for the movie. It was very good. And thank you also for Restrepo, which I thought was a really powerful film.
Thank you.
And kudos to Tim in absentia. You touched on a lot of themes in this film from, as you say, what is manhood, PTSD, relationships of sons and fathers, perceptions of America. Can you just talk a little bit more about that as a filmmaker, how that evolved? I mean, were these themes you knew you wanted to explore? Did they unfold? And then how, in maybe the editing process, did you hone in on that? And then just quickly, I noticed the music of Chris Whitley in some of the music. So if you could talk about your music selections for that.
Yeah. I had a general idea. I wanted to talk about coming back from war and why it's hard to give war up, which seems like a sort of impolitic thing to say, but it's the truth for many people. And I wanted to talk about the state of the country. It seemed like, we're a very strong, amazing country in some senses, and that we were in a lot of pain and experiencing a lot of division in other senses. I just wanted to understand it, And but beyond that, other topics sort of came up as we rolled along. One of them was manhood, and I sort of planted that question a little bit because it was on my mind, but not enormous. I just sort of said, "Hey guys, that scene that you saw, literally, I was like, hey guys, when people say be a man about it, what are they talking about?" It was really an open-ended question, and it would turn into a conversation because the guys were interested in it, But I mainly tried to be responsive to the experience we were having and the issues that was bringing up. I asked the guys, "What do you like best about women?" Because we were not with women for quite a long time, and we were missing them, And so I asked, I don't know if you remember, but I asked all those guys, like, what do you like best about women? So it was just a response to this experience we were having. Sorry, the second half? Oh yeah, I just shamelessly delved into my musical tastes and hope to get it past the HBO editorial team.
Right. So I want to give Jay a chance to kind of wrap it up and maybe ask the last question. But before we do that, I want to ask you, so you've done a series of films now, you've done your Iliad and you've done your Odyssey, so kind of what's next for you?
I don't know what film I'm going to make next. I don't know if I will make another film. I don't see myself as a filmmaker. I feel like film is the best way to communicate certain topics. And if I start working on another topic that sort of begs for a film, I'll go do it. But I'm not going to look for a topic just so I can make another film. I'm much more, I consider myself a writer, I guess, and I'm right now I'm about to expand the article I wrote about PTSD and about modern society and how it affects us all. I'm going to expand it into a short book, so that's what I'm doing right now.
Jay?
Well, I think we've had enough. It's been a good full meal. Sebastian, bless you. Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure, everybody. Thank you.